Now it's my pleasure to introduce someone I've known 15 years, Dr. Ben Wright. When I met him, he was the president of Dunwoody, which position he held from 2002 to 2009. But altogether, he'd been with Dunwoody 25 years and well known in this community, a Rotarian for 28 years with the Minneapolis City of Lakes Club. Has many accomplishments, written a couple books, but he's here today, and just personally, he has two wonderful daughters married that each have two wonderful grandchildren. So with 4 grandchildren in the area, he and his wife Donna are very blessed and happy and busy. But he's here today to talk about the legacy of Dunwoody. Most of us do not know that Mr. Dunwoody did a lot of things in this community and has contributed to the history of this community beyond what we could even imagine. So Ben has come today to talk about that. He has some posters. He prefers the non-techie kind of presentation, which I can identify with. So let's welcome Dr. Ben Wright, please.
Well, thank you, Jim. I'm delighted to be here. I'm actually going to talk about 2 Dunwoody legacies, and the posters are meant to introduce you to one Dunwoody, the man, William Hood Dunwoody, whose portrait is right here, which is, I believe, still on deposit at the Minneapolis Institute of Art. Is that right, Dawn? Or has it been moved out to Woodhill? That's what we're trying to do. So I want to talk first of all about the man, and then I want to talk about the second topic will be Dunwoody College of Technology and the legacy of that institution, which is over 100 years old. I thought what I would do is, if any of you are interested, I brought 2 copies of the history of Dunwoody. They can circulate if you want to just take a quick look at them. If anyone is interested in having a copy, you can talk to Dawn afterwards. Dunwoody has some left. I don't make anything off them, so I'm not pitching it for myself. Any proceeds go to Dunwoody, a nonprofit institution. Well, let's talk first of all about this gentleman, William Hood Dunwoody. A real pioneer, a real giant in the early history of Minneapolis and Minnesota. His problem was he and his wife had no children, which meant that there was no legacy in terms of children or family members who could continue the legacy, continue the name, continue the traditions. So instead, what he did, and his wife, Kate Dunwoody, they left their entire fortune to this community and built some great institutions. But let me talk about these posters, which are a little smaller from a distance than I thought they might be. This is Mr. Dunwoody. I'll go over here. Dunwoody built his fortune initially through the Washburn Crosby Company. And the Washburn Crosby Company, I think as you know, was the forerunner of General Mills. So one of his principal legacies, William Dunwoody, is to build this institution, General Mills. The other thing I want to show, this is a picture of the Minneapolis, the milling district back in the 19th century. The next poster is an advertisement that Washburn Crosby put out to promote its international business, and I'll say more about that in a moment. Gold medal flower, I think probably most of you are aware of, that was named Gold Medal Flower because it won all of these awards back in the late 1800s. And then the last one up here is the board of directors of Washburn Crosby Company back in about 2005, and if you want to look at that, you'll see a lot of names on there that you might recognize. James S. Bell, James Ford Bell, for example, were members of the board of directors of Washburn Crosby Company. Dunwoody did 2 or 3 things that really put Washburn Crosby on the map. First of all, he was asked by Governor Washburn, who was the founder of the Washburn Crosby Company, to go to England in about 1877 to see if he could open up the British market to Minneapolis flour. He was so successful in doing that that within 5 years, Minneapolis and Washburn Crosby were exporting a great amount of their flour overseas, particularly to England and to Scotland. And so in a sense, Dunwoody was personally responsible for creating the international reputation of Washburn Crosby Company and helping to build it. Another thing he did is when Mr. Crosby, the first John Crosby, died, who had been the managing partner of Washburn Crosby Company, when he passed away about 1886, I believe it was, Dunwoody went out east and recruited a new CEO for the company, and that was James S. Bell, whom he brought back to Minneapolis, and James S. Bell and Dunwoody, between the two of them, ran the company for the next 20 or so years. Another thing Dunwoody did, got to keep an eye on the clock because I'm covering over 100 years in about 20 minutes. The Washburn Crosby flour mills were not owned by the Washburn Crosby Company. They were owned by the estate of Governor Washburn, who had died in 1882. In 1899, just before the turn of the century, there was a real threat from some eastern flour interests to buy up a lot of flour mills across the United States and create a monopoly, to create what was known as a flour trust. If they had gotten a hold of the mills that Washburn Crosby Company used to mill their flour, they would have put Washburn Crosby Company out of business. William Dunwoody got on a train, went to Philadelphia, negotiated with the estate of Governor Washburn, bought 75% of the stock of the mills, thereby preventing this outside interest from buying up Washburn Crosby Company. And it preserved Minneapolis as the flour capital of the United States, preserved competition in this marketplace in terms of flour milling, and also the other thing it meant was that now Dunwoody himself was the largest stockholder of Washburn Crosby Company by far. He had much more stock than James S. Bell, who was actually the managing president of the company. So he was really, even though William Dunwoody never wanted his name on the company, he was kind of a private, humble sort of person. He was the principal owner of the company, if you want to look at it that, up until 1914 when he passed away. So he built his fortune through milling. Another part of his legacy was in banking. This is a picture of the old Northwestern National Bank building of Minneapolis. Dunwoody was the very first depositor of the Northwestern National Bank of Minneapolis. He became a director early on. At the time of his death, he was the president of the bank, and so he was one of the real leaders in building that particular bank in Minneapolis, and I think, as you probably all know, later on, the Northwestern National Bank Company merged with Wells Fargo. So much as he was one of the founders of General Mills, Dunwoody was also one of the founders of Wells Fargo. So that was another part of his business legacy. Dunwoody, in his last 15 years, devoted himself more and more to some of his social pursuits, some of his social interests. And philanthropy was very important to him and his wife, Kate. This picture over here is of a small hospital known as Abbott Hospital for Women and Children, which was founded by William Dunwoody to serve his good friend, Dr. Abbott, and Kate had persuaded him to buy a building and create a company, really create an organization called Abbott Hospital. Dunwoody was the founder of Abbott Hospital, and when he died in 1914, he left the hospital to Westminster Presbyterian Church, which ran it as Abbott Hospital for a number of years until it merged with Northwestern Hospital. And so what we have today is Abbott Northwestern Hospital. So we have another major Minnesota institution which Dunwoody's hands are all over. Another one, the last picture on the far right up there, is the Minneapolis Institute of Art. Dunwoody was a member of the Society of Fine Arts, and he and his wife were persuaded to make a major gift in 1911 to help raise money to actually build an art museum. There was the Society of Fine Arts, but they didn't have an art museum, and they wanted to build one. So there was a very special dinner held at the Minneapolis Club, and it was a fundraising dinner, probably one of the first of its kind in Minneapolis. You've probably all been to them since then, but this was kind of a unique thing. When they announced that William Dunwoody had personally pledged $100,000 to build the museum, and that Clinton Morrison had pledged the land to build on which to place the museum, the audience went wild, and before the evening was out, they had raised $250,000. Within the month, they had raised $500,000, and that was enough, if you can believe it, to build this incredible art museum, which opened its doors in 1915. That wasn't good enough for Dunwoody. In his last will and testament, he left $1 million to the Art Institute to purchase art, to purchase pieces of paintings and that sort of thing. The last I heard, the Art Institute had an endowment, a Dunwoody endowment of over $4 million. They have purchased something like 2,000 works of art through the Dunwoody endowment. If you walk around the museum and look at some of the labels, you'll frequently see the label purchased by the Dunwoody Fund. Well, that's the endowment created by William Dunwoody in his last will and testament. So the Art Institute, another major institution in this community, really very much touched, very much under the influence of William Dunwoody, and also, I might add, his wife, Kate Dunwoody, who donated this particular picture of her husband to the museum. Well, that's a fairly brief introduction to William Dunwoody. I'd like to say a lot more if I could, but unfortunately I have to talk a little bit about the 100 years and more of the college. And the book that's being circulated, I wrote back in anticipation of the centennial of the college in 2014. And the title of the book is For the Better Performance of Life's Duties, the 100-year history of Dunwoody College of Technology. Well, what does that title mean? Well, I want to read to you a quote from the last will and testament of William Dunwoody, which ran on for page after page, and all the philanthropic gifts he made were quite impressive. But probably the most impressive thing about his will was this statement, in which he created Dunwoody Institute, which is now known as Dunwoody College of Technology. He wanted to leave, and he did leave $3 million, and his wife left $1.5 million, $4.5 million back in 1914 and 1915, which in today's dollars would probably be well in excess of $100 million, to establish the William Hood Dunwoody Industrial Institute. And this institution, its purpose would be to provide for all time a place where youth without distinction on account of race, color, or religious prejudice may learn the useful trades and crafts and thereby fit themselves for the better performance of life's duties. For the better performance of life's duties. What Dunwoody was talking about is he wanted a school that would educate young people, not only to have skills and trades where they could make a living and contribute to our economy, but where they would make a contribution to their society. They would be good citizens. That was very important to him. The other part of that statement I just read to you, without distinction on account of race, color, or religious prejudice. Remember, 1914 was a time when our nation's capital, the administration of the so-called progressive President Woodrow Wilson was reinstituting segregation, racial segregation in our nation's capital. Minnesota was largely a white community back then, and for William Dunwoody to say that he wanted an institution that would not discriminate based on race, religion, or other characteristics was pretty far-sighted, I believe. And so that is another element of the school he created, which would be a school which would be open to all people. That was the assumption, that was the expectation. Well, so he left this money he named the first board of trustees of the college, and one of the guests you met today was a former member of the Dunwoody Board of Trustees, Joel Elfman, and I was also very lucky in that he was my very first board chair when I took over as president of Dunwoody, so that was a great privilege and a lot of fun. He named the Board of Trustees, many of whose faces are on that one poster up there because they were colleagues at the Washburn Crosby Company. And this Board of Trustees not only knew what Dunwoody wanted, but they had the skill, the expertise to roll out this school within about 10 months. In December of 1914, Dunwoody Institute began to offer its first instruction for students. And it has been going for over 100 years since then. Now, the first important thing the school had to do was to find a leader, someone who would create this new institution. There weren't vocational technical schools back in 1914. So what is this school going to look like? Well, the person they recruited to become the first, we would probably call him president, but he was called director back then, was a man named Charles Prosser, Dr. Charles Prosser. Prosser was an intellectual of the same status as John Dewey, who was an educational philosopher, very well known. Prosser's area of expertise was vocational education, and he came to Dunwoody and established Dunwoody as a laboratory school, a school that would become kind of a prototype for this kind of school around the nation. And the principle of a Dunwoody school was that it would be modeled after business practices. It would train young people in the crafts, the skills that would be needed when they went out to work in business and industry. And so the labs were real-life situations. The instructors were people who came right out of the industry and knew what the industry needed from them. So it was very closely tied to the business community that it was going to serve. And whatever the program, whether it was automotive, electrical, mechanical, drafting, or whatever, it was very closely tied to those industries that it was going to serve. And the Dunwoody Institute became so famous, and Dr. Prosser himself so famous, that he has been called the father of vocational education in the United States. One of the things he did automatically, because in 1914 was the beginning of World War I in Europe, 1917 the United States got into the war, one of the first things that Dunwoody did was get involved in wartime vocational training. It trained people for the services in automotive repair, in mechanical drafting, in welding, in some of the basic skills that would be needed by the armed forces. So Dunwoody was a major player in training during World War I, and also in World War II. The same thing happened in World War II when vocationally trained people, skilled people, were very much needed for the armed forces. And so Dunwoody played a major role in both of those war efforts. The other thing I found as I was researching this history of the college was when you looked and talked to graduates of Dunwoody from the 1930s, the era, the decade of the Great Depression, and you probably all know the horror stories about employment during the Great Depression, when it's estimated that anywhere from 1/4 to 1/3 of the labor force was unemployed. Dunwoody graduates told me time after time that they owed their lives, their careers to Dunwoody because, unlike other people, when they got their diploma, when they came out of Dunwoody, they could get a job. So you can imagine how indebted they were to this institution that gave them an opportunity when there were very few opportunities in the nation. Let me jump ahead to after World War II and zip through this about as quickly as I can. Dunwoody, as I said, under Charles Prosser, who, by the way, was director until 1945, until the end of World War II. And along with William Dunwoody, I think you'd have to say Charles Prosser was probably the great founder of Dunwoody Institute, Dunwoody College. Some of the things the school has done since World War II that I think should be mentioned very quickly. One is they gave great support and great leadership to the growth and birth of area technical institutes in the state of Minnesota, what we call technical colleges today. The leadership for forming those public institutions, a lot of the leadership came first from Prosser, then from his successor, John Butler, and in spite of the fact that Dunwoody was private and nonprofit, they believed in this mission of technical education for as wide an audience as possible, and therefore they supported the growth and the creation of all of these technical schools that now exist throughout the state of Minnesota. So that was one of the things they did. Another thing they did was they got very active in international education. Dunwoody was involved in anywhere from 25 to 30 countries around the world from the 1950s through the 1980s in training people from places like Indonesia, from Egypt, Venezuela, places that would set up their own technical schools on the Dunwoody model. So our involvement in international training was quite considerable during those 3 or 4 decades. Another thing that started happening quite dramatically in the 1980s was the computer revolution, where everything went to computer. We used to have drafting tables at Dunwoody for our architectural drafting programs and mechanical drafting programs. That's all computerized today. Automotive, you can't put your head under a car hood today and do normal mechanical work the way you once did. You need diagnostic equipment because it's all computerized. If you buy a new car, I'm sure you are aware of how many computers are in that automobile. So Dunwoody was very involved, inevitably, in that computer revolution that started taking over technical education back in the 80s. Another thing the school did is it realized that its graduates were looking for opportunities to advance within their businesses where they were employed. And one of the things they were finding was a roadblock to their advancement because they did not have a 4-year college degree. So Dunwoody, in the last 15, 20 years, has started to offer bachelor degrees for their graduates so that they can also advance into other fields and have opportunities that wouldn't exist to them if they only had a 2-year degree. So the school has 2-year degrees now, it has 4-year degrees, and one of the most recent initiatives, it's moving very aggressively into the whole engineering field. It's got an engineering school now, and the whole emphasis of all of these programs remains what it's always been, practical, hands-on learning. So even if you have a 4-year degree, what you're going to be doing is you're going to be practicing how you use that degree in the field, on the job. And that's the one thing that has always distinguished Dunwoody graduates. We like to talk about Dunwoody graduates as being graduates who are worth more. They're held in high demand by employers. They make more money when they come out of school than graduates of many other institutions. And Joel Elfman is just one example of the distinguished alumni that it has produced. Mortenson Company, I'm sure you've all heard of Mortenson Construction Company. M.A. Mortenson went to Dunwoody. You may have heard of Maury's Automotive Group, all the Maury's dealerships around town. Maury Wagner was a Dunwoody graduate. If some of you still have a Lund boat that you fish out of, Howard Lund was a Dunwoody graduate. These were graduates who went on and did more than just have a craft or a trade. These are people who built businesses, created opportunities for other people, and really contributed to the life, the economic well-being of the state of Minnesota. And with that, I better stop and see if you have any questions. And Jim, maybe I'm over my limit.
This is great. We want to be able to ask some questions. And our club had the opportunity to do a vocational visit to Dunwoody about 10 or 12 years ago. And what was interesting is after lunch we toured around, like in the automotive section, nobody was there. They had been there in the morning, and in the afternoon they were out in those dealerships, hands-on learning. And what I remember is all these graduates were getting like 4 and 5 job offers when they graduated. So it's just an amazing story, and the values you talked about that Mr. Dunwoody communicated are so important today as well.
Well, and you may have heard a lot about a lot of our manufacturing companies desperate to hire people. They can't find skilled technicians. Well, we've been saying that at Dunwoody for 15 or 20 years. This is not a new story, and yet we continue to rediscover this story. I don't understand it, why the message hasn't gotten out, that there is this incredible need and opportunity for trained technicians in all sorts of fields. But we continue, and I'm an old liberal arts guy, we continue to labor under this assumption that you're nobody if you don't have a 4-year liberal arts degree. Well, I think 4-year liberal arts degree is valuable, but you got to be able to do something. And that's where Dunwoody comes in. Yes?
I was wondering how about duplicating Dunwoody's 12th in the nation? 12 of them.
Say that again, I'm sorry?
The school get duplicated in 12 different states in the United States.
Expansion.
No, we don't have 12 sites, if that's what you... Oh, should. Oh, no question, no question.
So what can we do to do that?
Well, I'm not...
I give you 100%, 2,000%. This is what we need in our nation.
Yep.
And we have a bunch of kids in this liberal arts and music training and all this. But they are not useful in building our manufacturing industry.
We have to keep talking to ourselves, to grandparents and parents, and get the message out that, you know, there's nothing inferior about a technical degree. There's nothing inadequate about it. In fact, you can get ahead much quicker if you can also do something. Yes?
How difficult is it for a student to get into Dunwoody?
Dunwoody is more difficult to get into today than it used to be, but one of the principles that William Dunwoody believed in was open education, was open access. In the old days, we used to say we have an open door policy, but the only problem for Dunwoody students is the front door is open, but so is the back door. So if you can't cut it, if you're not willing to work, if you're not willing to put in the effort, you can graduate right out the back door too. So the opportunity to get in it's not difficult, but to get out, the good way, you got to work hard. And we have any number of, used to have, and Jim, I don't know if Jim is still here, statistic used to be that 20 to 30% of Dunwoody students came to us with prior college education, either a degree or more than 1 year at another institution. Why did they come to Dunwoody? Because they realized they needed a skill so that they could get a job.
What kind of financing or scholarship aid do you have?
Dunwoody students are eligible for a lot of private scholarships, and these two folks here raise a lot of money for Dunwoody so that scholarships can be provided for Dunwoody students. But in addition to that, Dunwoody students are eligible for the state and federal grant and loan programs. So they do take advantage of that.
The FAFSA.
Yep.
What's the average tuition?
Does it cost?
Don, I've been retired for about 8 years.
Without room and board, it runs between low 20s to low 30,000 per year.
There's one more question. Oh, okay.
But what we also say is that the good thing about, let's say you even have to take on $20,000 in loans to finance that education. Within 3 years, because of the jobs you're going to have, you will be able to pay off that debt very quickly. It's not as though you're going to be, he's not here, thank goodness, my son-in-law, when my daughter first met him, he was parking cars in downtown Minneapolis, and he had a degree from St. Thomas, a 4-year degree from St. Thomas. He met my daughter, who gave him the Dunwoody spiel. He came to the electrical program. He's been employed as an electrician for the last 8 years and making a very good living. So he's got a bachelor's degree and the Dunwoody degree. Joel.
Just to mention, most students by their second year are already working in the trade that they're being trained in. So, I mean, it's almost a no-brainer that you pay for the first year, you can earn your way through the second year, and by then you have a job to earn a 4-year degree if you want, without debt.
That's right.
It happens. It can happen a lot.
And these employers are fighting with one another to get these students as part-time employees.
Wow. Take a couple more questions.
Well, it's not so much a question as I want to put a plug in for something and ask you. Are you familiar with Scheck's? Have you looked it up, Mill in southern Minnesota?
No.
It's apparently, all I know is someone in St. Paul started it, but it still operates today as a historic flour mill. And talking about technology, they're using water power from the Root River.
Okay.
And they'll walk you through the whole process from taking a piece of corn and using their mechanics of the early 1900s. And when you leave with a couple of bags of flour. And it is the most wonderful thing in the world.
That would be a great outing for Dunwoody students, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Great to know about. Yes, sir.
Anecdote. While you were talking, I was shortening a watchmaker. That's a trick I learned from my father-in-law, Bob Erickson's father, who graduated from Dunwoody in watchmaking.
No, he went to the Stone Watch School, but he didn't go to Dunwoody. He did,
But
Dunwoody did not have a watchmaking school. They had he went to another college.
Okay. Yes, sir.
A quick anecdote. My niece, who's all of 102 pounds, went to Dunwoody, worked in automotive repair, did some work with the Mercedes Benz, was so impressed by it all, she decided to go back to college, got a degree in electrical engineering, and is working for 3M.
Wonderful.
It's just an amazing story.
That's great.
What I like to do is just kind of make a general comment on this. Don Stiles and I took 2 instructors from Hennepin Technical College and 2 students to Germany 4 years ago because we were very interested in doing what we could do to raise the whole profile of technical education. I think what we have been working with since then is in the schools. We need to start telling students when they're in the 4th grade, 5th grade, and 6th grade what they can make in different professions. So many parents will tell students, you want a 4-year degree, you don't want to do this or that. But if they tell them how much money they can make in these different areas, many times they will go into it. But I think it's something that, because David was talking about, my father was a watchmaker, but he attended Dunwoody. And he always felt that his education was not valued as much as my mother's, who was a teacher. And I think it's something in society that's long-standing that we really need to work to correct. And we're in a situation right now where, because the economy is running along very well, all the people are looking for jobs, and I know all of the Minsky schools are actively working with employers and things. But we can do a lot to take and encourage students to really look at all the options available to them. So I would encourage all of us in our interactions with all of our high school students, other people we deal with, to think seriously about telling them to look at all the options they have available, and it may fit them better. I'll finish with one story. When I was at the University of Minnesota, Bob Brunix, who was president of the University of Minnesota, told me a story about one of his sons who came to him in tears one day, and he said, you should just try being the son of 2 blank PhDs, because both Bob and his wife had PhDs. The son felt that his skills were more hands-on things. And Bob Brunix, to his credit, said, you should go to Hennepin Tech at that time. He did, and the kid has done very well. But again, it's the kind of thing that we have so many biases, and we have to look at what is best for each child's individual talents.
Well, thank you.
Well said.
And thank you, Ben. This
Yep.
is wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you.